Alright, so this first problem, we're just kind of looking to try to figure out what quadrant that is. And try to look at that without looking at that, without thinking about your unit circle. So at least without looking at your unit circle. So we know that in this case, I can think about this. Well, that's bigger than 1, right? So 7 over 6 is bigger than 1. So if it's bigger than 1 and less than 1.5, this is kind of the way that I approach it. Bigger than 1, here's what we know this is 1.5 pi or 3 or however 2. I know this is 2, and I know this is a half. So this we know is bigger than 1, but less than 1.5, so I know it has to be in here in quadrant 3. All right, so for this next one, we know I'm looking at what? So here, if I'm going negative, I know that I'm going to the left, so this would be then 0, this would be a half, this would be 1, and this would be 1.5. And so this one is not quite 2, right? So not quite 2 if I'm going negative, bigger than 1.5, so I know I have to be in here in quadrant 1. Because I'm going to the left because it's negative. All right, if I'm looking at 16 over 3, I know that 16 over 3 is the same as 5 and 1/3, right? So if this is 0, and this is a half, and this is 1, and this is 1.5, and this would be 2, then this would be still going around, this would be 2.5, this would be 3, this would be 4, 4.5, 5. And so I'm all the way to here, so I'm all the way in that section, so this is quadrant 3. All right, so for this problem, a couple things that I do know. Well, I know that so if I'm looking, I know that the x coordinate is -5 over 13. Okay, so we also can know that x corresponds to cosine, right? And I know that the y coordinate here is -12 over 13. And I know that the y coordinate corresponds to sine. So I can immediately already kind of think and draw out my triangle. If there's my angle theta, I know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So I can build, so if this is the opposite angle, I know that this is -12, and I know that this is 13. If I'm looking at cosine, we know cosine is adjacent, so I know that this is -5 over 13. So with that, I can already build in and develop all of my other trig pieces. So if I wanted to find tangent, that would be easy. We just know it's y over x, so this would be 12 over 5. If I wanted to find secant, we know secant's just the inverse of cosine, or hypotenuse over adjacent, so this would be -13 over 5. And cosecant is the inverse of sine, so this would be then -13 over 12. And there are all the other we could also do cotangent, and cotangent we know is just the inverse of tangent, so it'd just be 5 over 12. And so there's all our pieces if I know both the x and the y coordinate. All right, so here I'm just looking at trying to evaluate. So here I just want to find the value of cosine at 2 pi over 3. Well, I did tell you guys a little trick. Remember something about if it's over 3, so if I have something divided by 3, I know that the very first number has to be 1/2, and the second number has to be square root 3, right? So that's our little trick. Now I just got to know, is 2 over 3, what quadrant is that in? Well, that's bigger than a half. I'm thinking about your circle, right? So we know this is 0. There's a half. Well, that 2 over 3 is bigger than a half, but less than 1. So I know it has to be in quadrant 2. Well, I know in quadrant 2, the x is negative. So there we go. We have that without even really looking at all of the values of the unit circle. I know that the cosine here is simply the x-coordinate, or -1/2 would be the answer for that one. All right, also looking at this, remember once again, I can think about the little trick. If it's divided by 6, so 6 is in the bottom, we know the big number comes first. So this is square root 3 over 2, and this is then 1/2 at 7 over 6. We just need to now know the signs is it positive or negative? So essentially what quadrant is it in? Here's 0. We know this is a half. I know this is 1. I know this is 1.5, right? So 7 over 6, bigger than 1, but not bigger than 1.5, so it's in quadrant 3. In quadrant 3, both x and y are negative. Now if I want to know the cosecant of this, we know cosecant. So cosecant I know is the opposite of what? Opposite of sine, or 1 over y. So I'm just going to invert the y, so the cosecant here is -2. So this one I can also do the same little trick. Since it's over 6, I know that square root 2 comes first. I know that 1/2 comes second. And I'm looking at all of these pieces. Is it bigger than 1, less than 1? So I know this is 0, I know this is a half, I know this is 1, I know this is 1.5. Well, 11 over 6 is bigger than 1, bigger than 1.5, but not bigger than 2. So if I went all the way back around, that'd be 2. So I know it has to be there in quadrant 4. Well, what do we know in quadrant 4? In quadrant 4, x is positive and y is negative. So x is positive, y is negative. So if I'm looking at secant, I know secant is the inverse of cosine. So it's the opposite of cosine, or 1 over the cosine, which means 1 over x. So I'm looking then at 2 over square root 3. Can't have the denominator, can't have the square root 3 in the bottom, so multiply that out. And I get 2 square root 3 over 3. And that would be our answer. For these type of questions, it's really thinking about the difference between whether it's an even function or whether it's an odd function. So is it even or is it odd? So if it's even or odd. So let's think for a second about something like that. So if I was a positive, so let's say this is the positive version. If I did the same thing and make it negative, let's split those into its pieces. So if I took this positive, we know it'd be made up of x. So it'd be x, and it'd have a positive y. If I had the negative, it would also be here at the same x, but would make it a negative y. So x is the same regardless of whether I add in a negative x or not. So even functions are always the same. Always the same as the positive functions. And odd would just flip. So odd, it's going to be whatever the positive value is. If you had a negative x, or we made it in a negative x, it would be the opposite sign. So whatever the positive value is, this is going to be the opposite sign. So the only ones that are even functions are cosine, and because secant is related to cosine and secant are both even functions. Everything else is odd. So I know the values at pi 3. At pi 3, I know because it's over 3, I know the 1/2, or the small number, comes first. I got square root 3, 2. I know this is quadrant 1, so these are both positive. So here the cosine value is 1/2. All right, if it's the negative, because cosine is an even function, regardless of whether this is negative or positive, this is still equal to 1/2. So both of those values are the same because it is even. So both of those are both 1/2. All right, now for sine, if it's 5 over 6, so I know here, if it's over 6, so if I'm dividing by 6, I know the first one, square root 3 over 2, second one, 1/2. 5 over 6, not quite 1, but bigger than 1/2, so therefore I know that the x is negative. So in this case, we know the sine is 1/2. Well, if it's the negative, we're just going to get the opposite sign. Whatever this was, since that's positive 1/2, this is going to be negative 1/2. So those are our two values there. All right, so I'm just going to work out one of these. So probably the easiest way or the way to think about this is thinking about it from the triangle perspective. So sine, it says square root 39 over 8. So if I'm thinking opposite, this is square root 39 and this is 8. What is this value? Well, that value I know if I use c squared equals a squared plus b squared. I know that c squared would be 64. This would be 39 and would equal plus b squared. If I subtract out the 39, I'm going to get then 25 equals b squared and square root that, so this would have to be 5. So I could find cosine really easily if all it asked me for cosine would be then 5 over 8. If I asked you for any other pieces, you could just evaluate it the normal way that you would, just kind of plug them all in. Right? So same way on 32. On problem 40 and 42, I just want you to find the value of those. So I know if it's over 4, a couple things that we can kind of point out real quick and easy. I know if it's over 4, I know it's square root 2 over 2 and square root 2 over 2. So regardless, and then I just got to think, where is this? So 9 over 4 is just a little bit bigger than 2. So if I thought about the circle, all right, we know there's 0, once again, 0.5, 1, 1.5, this is going all the way back around would be 2. And so 9 over 4, a little bit bigger than 2. So I know I'm there in quadrant 1. So if I'm looking at cosecant, I know cosecant is the opposite of sine, and so this is going to then be 2 over square root 2 multiplied by square root 2. And so I get 2 square root 2 over 2, which the 2's would cancel. And so this would just equal square root 2 for number 40. All right, for the next one, regardless of the negative sign or not, I know since it's over 4, we're still looking at square root 2 over 2 and square root 2 over 2. So let's just figure out where would that be. So if I was going around the circle, so if I was going around backwards, this would be 0, this would be a half, this would be 1, this would be 1.5, this would be 2 over here, and this would be slightly bigger than 2. So I'm down here in quadrant 4. In quadrant 4, I know that x is positive and y is negative, so I know x is positive, y is negative. If I'm looking at secant, though, secant we know, secant is the inverse of cosine, so that's, secant is the same thing as 1 over cosine, or 1 over x. So it would end up being then the same as that. So we would have 2 over square root 2 multiplied by square root 2. So I'd have 2 square root 2 over 2. And the 2's cancel out, and we just get square root 2. All right, so that's it for 4.1 and 4.2. I'll work out the rest of them in the next video.